Spray-dried plasma has been extensively researched and used in calf milk replacers for nearly 20 years, but most of the research has been conducted using bovine plasma and not porcine plasma. And a lesser quantity of research has been done at increased inclusion rates in the milk replacer and in highly daily feeding rate type milk replacers. Our study attempted to address the question, can spray-dried porcine plasma successfully replace 30% of the whey-based protein in a milk replacer fed at 40.6 kilograms or 90 pounds per calf over an 8-week period? And we in fact did find that it could without affecting feed conversion or body weight gain. Spray-dried plasma, particularly bovine, is well proven to perform in calf milk replacers. There are 19 published calf studies, or studies in 17 journal articles. 10 of them reported using bovine plasma, 1 porcine plasma, 3 more examined a comparison of bovine porcine or porcine to an all-milk replacer, and 3 simply denoted animal plasma, which I surmise was probably bovine plasma. The 15 of them measured average daily gain, and it's typical to get a comparable average daily gain performance to an all-milk. 4 of them did note a statistically significant increase in average daily gain, and this occurs typically where there's a stronger or a more severe enteric disease challenge. One of the 2 that reported a negative average daily gain if plasma was fed examined replacing 66% or 100% of the replaceable whey protein in the milk replacer, so it's a very extreme example. Plasma commonly increases starter grain intake. 5 of the 14 noted that. The hallmark of plasma studies has been reductions in the severity or duration of scours or incidents. And in fact, 10 of the 17 that reported scour scores or diarrhea measures did report a statistically significant reduction. 4 reported reduced mortality, and 3 reported reduced use of medications. The example to the left is a good one it also has a porcine plasma element to it. The calves were fed 22 kilograms, a very traditional 20-20 program, pound or pound and a quarter a day. And if 5% plasma was included, it did reduce the mortality from 25% down to either 7.5% or 5%, depending on the plasma source used. These calves in the study also noted a statistically significant about 30% reduction in diarrhea. So our study, our objective was to compare the health and performance of calves fed different rates of porcine plasma in their milk replacer. And our hypothesis was that the porcine plasma replacing 30% of the whey-based protein in a modern milk replacer feeding strategy of around 90 pounds or 40.6 kilograms of a 26-20 milk replacer, that it would perform comparably, and that if we noted a high severity or incidence of diarrhea, that this increased inclusion rate of 10% would have a bigger impact on improving gut health than 5%. There were 4 rooms of calves, 320 total, that were sourced either from local dairy farms or from auction facilities, and they were delivered to Mapleview Agri, which is a milk replacer manufacturer with a grain-fed veal research facility located in Ontario. Upon arrival, the whole blood was drawn on 240 of 320 of the calves for evaluation of serum total proteins. One of the rooms was filled during the height of the first part of the shutdown, so a technician couldn't be there. Calves were individually housed in 1 square meter individual stalls. They were pooled into groups of 5 at weaning, and the calves were bucket fed at 26-17 milk replacer according to the feeding strategy in the table to the right. They started at 650 grams per feeding. They peaked at over 1 kilogram of powder per day, 650 grams per day, and they peaked at over 1 kilogram of powder per day, and then they were slowly tapered down to being weaned at 325 grams once a day, week 8. No additives or medications of any type were added to the milk replacer. Calves constantly had ad-lib access to a high-quality texturized starter grain. There was 20% crude protein up to 8 weeks. Then they were transitioned to a corn and pellet diet with 2% straw, and they were continuously fed offered water. These pictures are of the calf research facility. You can see the high-quality starter grain in the upper left, the whole corn and pellet with 2% straw mixture that they were transitioned to after weaning, the group pens and the individual pens, and the milk mixing room. Calves were randomized into blocks of 10. They were allotted to one of 3 milk replacer treatments, either an all milk protein milk replacer using whey-based protein, or where 15% of the crude protein came from spray-dried porcine plasma but was otherwise in all milk, and was included the plasma NutriPro-P from APC at 5% inclusion rate, or 100 pounds per ton. And the third diet was doubling that to 30% of the crude protein from spray-dried porcine plasma, meaning plasma had to be included at 10% of the formula. All protein-containing ingredients were analyzed for lysine, methionine, and threonine, and synthetic L-lysine, D-L-methionine, or L-threonine were used to standardize all 3 diets to 2.4% lysine, 0.8% methionine, and 1.6% threonine. Grain was weighed back on day 7, 14, 21, 28, 56, and day 78. Milk refusals were recorded each day, twice a day when milk was fed. Calves that were scored daily for fecal consistency for the first 4 weeks of the trial. 0 was considered normal. 1 was a soft stool with the piles but spreads slightly. Scour score 2 was a runny stool that spreads easily. Scour score 3 is a watery stool that was liquid consistency and that spatters. Any fecal score of 2 or 3 were classified as positive for diarrhea and were given an electrolyte, True Vitalite electrolyte. The antimicrobials, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory meds or IV fluids were all recorded for each calf. Sulfa was administered, a sulfa-based drug, intramuscularly, and oral meloxicam, the NSAID, the anti-inflammatory, were injected into the calves if they had a fecal score of 3. And if the score continued for 5 scoring periods, they were treated with Baytril. Here's what porcine plasma looks like. It's guaranteed minimum 78% protein. Calves with respiratory disease were diagnosed and treated. Their scoring system used was the UC Davis system, and a score greater than 5 meant that they were treated with a Nuflor shot. If that didn't do the job, then they were hit with XNL for 4 consecutive days or until recovery occurred. And then a Canadian drug that's accessible there, danofloxacin, was used in conjunction with meloxicam as the third treatment. The statistical analysis was conducted by Dr. Dave Renow. He imported from Excel into Stata 14 to do his analysis. A linear regression model and Cox proportional hazard model were used for data analysis. More details of his statistical analysis are in the bullet points below. A total of 320 calves were placed, pods of 5 dispersed evenly in all 3 different treatment groups in each room. 110 total in the control, 105 in the 5% plasma, and 105 in the 10% plasma. 129 of these calves were sourced from dairies, local dairies, 132 from auction facilities, and 59 from a drover or order buyer, and there's no difference between the treatment groups in sourcing the calves or in serum total protein, which again was analyzed on 240 of the calves with a mean of 5.73 grams per deciliter of serum total protein. A relatively low for the quantity of sale barn calves, I think at least. Experienced FPT, failure passive transfer, was 14%, and there's no difference between the treatment groups. The observer, the producer, and the person responsible for data analysis were blinded to the treatment groups. In regards to health measures, the number of days of the fecal score greater than 2 was 1.6, 2.1, and 2.2 for the control, the 5% plasma, and the 10% plasma, respectively, with no differences between the groups statistically. And a measure of severe scours, in other words, calves that experienced a scour score of 3 had about a half a day on average across the room, and there was no difference between the groups. The calves that were treated at least once for diarrhea were roughly a third of the room, or a third of all the calves, and there was no difference between the treatment groups. The incidence of relapse, which would be a good indicator of severity of scours, was low at 6 to up to 10.5%, depending upon the group, and no difference between the groups. However, there was a profound incidence of respiratory disease. In fact, 2/3 of the calves were treated for respiratory disease, and there's no difference between the treatment groups in incidence of respiratory disease or in severity, because the incidence of being treated more than once was not different between the groups, and it was roughly 2/3 of all the calves that initially were diagnosed. Very little IV fluids, just 10 calves, so no differences. Mortality was low at 11, just 3.4% of the entire group. And note that only one died from diarrhea in the whole entire 320 calves. So again, an indication that diarrhea was not too severe in this room. Incidence of feed refusals was very low. In regards to respiratory disease, there was no effect by treatment group, but I think it interesting to note, just in general, that the heavier calves, those over 112 pounds at placement, had a lower risk of having respiratory disease. And perhaps to no surprise, calves sourced in an auction barn, and also those from a drover, either tended or were more prone to respiratory disease as compared to those from a local farm. In regards to body weight, the calves, each individual calf was weighed weekly to day 56, and then again at day 78, and there's no difference at any measure between the control group and the 10% plasma group, or between the control group and the 5% plasma group, with the exception of day 78, when the control group was heavier than the 5% plasma group. All the raw data, if you care to stop the presentation, you can review this, and you can see them for each week with statistics. No differences in feed conversion, either pre-wean, post-wean, or during the entire study. So our conclusion was that spray-dried porcine plasma can replace 30% of the protein in a calf milk replacer without affecting body weight gain or feed conversion or health in this study. And interestingly, we think it because the incidence of diarrhea, although a third of the calves did experience diarrhea, it was not so severe, and that's probably why we didn't see any difference. There was a high incidence and severity of respiratory disease, and at least in this study, plasma had no effect. This research was funded by Animix and APC. I want to thank Mapleview Agri in Palmerston, Ontario, for conducting an excellent study. I want to thank Dr. Dave Renau of the Department of Population Medicine at the University of Guelph for his statistical analysis and assistance in study design and implementation. Aaron Cunin and Brian Cunin of Mapleview Agri for conducting a great study, and my coworkers Renelle Bloom and Luciane Barro, and Joe Crenshaw and Joy Campbell for their input and their financial support of this study.